Hey everyone! So I'm hoping that the StreamYard delay wasn't too bad, but welcome back to episode 2 of the Secular Literary Circle. I am back with Susan of
Hi.
Divine Disbelief. And currently Nathaniel is working on work stuff. He may or may not join us tonight. He said that he was probably going to sit this one out, but Susan is here and has the Susan version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is covered at the beginning of this chapter, and then I've got some information about how effectively, the Stoics were a little too into how Socrates died and what his death meant, so we'll be expanding on that a little bit. But welcome, everyone. I just created a new Secular Literary Circle playlist. You can find it over on the main channel page. This episode and the first episode where we covered the preface and the first chapter of Heaven and Hell are on there. So if you guys want to catch up and, join us for reading alongside us, then we've got that all set up for you guys. We got Mr. Parker and Rilla and Lisa and GeoSam in the house.
Hello.
So welcome, guys. It's good to see
y'all.
you.
I never can tell how close I have to get to my microphone. I'm just all like, I can never tell.
You're coming through loud and clear.
Yes. Cool.
So, sorry, by the way, that we're doing the advertising for StreamYard. I'm thinking about paying for it myself at some point, just so that we don't do the advertisement and so that we can do a proper background and stuff for these streams, just because OBS and I are not getting along very well, and since I have to stream from my upstairs computer that doesn't have quite as much bandwidth as the powerhouse that I do my video editing on, it's probably going to be a more stable stream if I do it through like a browser service like StreamYard than if I tried to do it off of my own computer right now. I've got gigabit internet, but my processor ain't the best, and OBS can be a little bit processor intensive at times.
It can. That's why we run it off of Nathaniel's computer, because it is way better than mine.
Yeah, this PC is a gaming PC, but the processor is probably the weakest component. It's older. It's got 32 gigs of RAM because I used to do video rendering and stuff like 3D rendering for fun on it. Nice. But like the processor on it is not good enough for video editing, whereas the one downstairs has a octa-core fucking 4.2 gigahertz overclock mess.
Damn.
So, I guess getting to the topic at hand, when we left off, we talked about some of the apocrypha. We talked about Perpetua. We talked about the Acts of Thomas, and Nathaniel actually went in a little bit to the Gospel of Thomas as well. And we talked about Ehrman's history and what brought him to writing about the afterlife.
Yeah.
And
I'm trying to like read through my notes and preparation and everything. So I'm like, yeah, sorry.
And we talked about kind of the strange obsession that the ancients had with detailing all of the sins and the terrible ways in which you would be punished in the afterlife, and how a lot of people think that the modern conceptualization of hell came from Dante's Inferno, but it actually predates that. Dante's Inferno itself was fan fiction inspired by the apocrypha. So today, at the end of that chapter, Bart Ehrman talks about how a lot of these ideas of the afterlife actually come from these apocryphal writings and not from the Bible, and how, to understand where they come from, we kind of have to look at some of the ancient conceptualizations of the afterlife, and from there, we start with the fear of the afterlife that folks had. We have a couple of quotes, I think, either from the apocrypha or the Bible, and then we start talking about the Epic of Gilgamesh. So, from there, again, if you guys are following along at home, we are on chapter 2. We're starting at the beginning, the fear of death. So
yeah, the main note that I had for this one was, aren't we all to some extent sort of afraid of death? Because I think it's a lot of the fear of the unknown. So it's sort of, I know that's what still sort of gets me even after my own deconversion, is still like,
it's almost impossible to imagine not existing. Like even when you get into like a deep state of meditation, which anybody who's practiced Zen meditation or anything like that, like you can get into a very deep state where your mind almost disappears, or if you've ever been in really deep in a float experience. But the idea of your mind not being there at all, of not even being able to observe your mind disappearing, that is incredibly frightening.
Right. And it's one of the ways that I've heard it put, I think Nathaniel said it a number of times, is it's the same thing as, what it was before you were born. Like you don't it's just this non-existence idea. And it's I can see why people do the whole afterlife thing. I totally can. It's just it's that uncertainty that gets me. And I think so much of the fear for a lot of people, it's not just me, for a lot of people in general, is we talked last week about all of the stuff in hell. It's like, if you believe in an afterlife and this idea of heaven and hell, specifically if in the Christian heaven and hell, it's like, oh my God, am I going to go to heaven and be super rewarded with everything, or am I gonna go to hell and suffer all this like eternal torment and doom?
Well, and it's interesting. One of the things that a lot of atheists like to talk about, and pagans will bring it up too, is that this idea of a dichotomy of heaven and hell being the only options is kind of silly. Like within the ancient world, there were a number of different ideas of where you went after death. Most of them were kind of gloomy, as Ehrman gets into. Particularly in the Middle East, you have, absolutely nothing, everything from sleeping to absolutely nothing to, just the sort of wispy existence, which is what the Homeric epics talk about, to the Stoics, which believe that you return to this sort of consciousness that is God, so to speak. The spark of your divine reason returns to Zeus. To like the Platonists, which had a much more complex afterlife, which, I think that some of the Christian afterlife may have been partially inspired by, and I'm curious to see if he gets into it, because I'm doing my best not to read ahead too much, especially because I keep making mistakes about what's in future chapters. I'm going to cover all of the ways that Ehrman gets this part wrong, and then, whoops.
It's all like, oh wait,
that's next week.
That's not how it went.
So this particular chapter 2, actually opens up with a quote from Measure for Measure, Claudio's quote.
Yeah, he says, "'Tis too horrible, the weariest and most loathed worldly life, that age, ache, penury, and imprisonment can lay on nature as a paradise to what we fear of death."
And so what follows is a discussion from him, kind of like what we were just talking about, where he talks about how terrifying death was in the ancient world as well. We've never really gotten over that fear. Yeah. If I remember right, he quotes 2 different psalms, doesn't he?
He does,
like on the next page.
Hamlet. Yeah, he does Psalm 86:12 through 13 and Psalm 32 through 3. So he's talking about how the psalmist says, praising God for saving him for the time being from death, imaged as the realm of Sheol.
Sheol or Sheol.
Sheol, thank you. I will give thanks to you, O Lord my God, with my whole heart, for great is your steadfast love toward me. You have delivered my soul from the depths of Sheol. And then in Psalm 32 through 3, O Lord my God, I cried to you for help, and you have healed me. O Lord, you brought up my soul from Sheol, restored me to life from among those gone down to the pit. The pit just sounds so, like,
dark.
Yeah, like kind of ominous. And it's like, it's further reinforcing that fear of that uncertainty in the afterlife and what you could potentially be subjected to. So it's like,
Well, yeah, and like it doesn't really seem like the pit is a punishment. Like when you read through the early parts of the Bible, it's more like sleep, which is part of the reason why justification of hell is so difficult for modern day Christians. Is if you go back into the Old Testament, there's nothing like burning or torment. Like there's this fear of going down into darkness or of eternal sleep, but like, the later parts of the Old Testament, they talk about some, an awakening of souls from the ground, so to speak, like God waking up the dead. So it's like it's more of a sleep or a vanishment than it is like torture or torment or punishment.
Yeah, like eternal doom and stuff. So I just like saying eternal doom. It's just fun to say.
So after that, he kind of talks about how terrifying death was, and then we get to the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I'm going to be copy and pasting. I'm going to be dropping the list from Digital Hammurabi in the live chat. That is their playlist on Mesopotamian literature, which contains a quite amusing rap on the Epic of Gilgamesh,
I'm
which
so excited
describes
to
the plot.
listen to that. I want to listen to that rap so badly.
From
Like,
Dr.
it sounds
Josh.
awesome. That's the best.
It's very Dr. Josh. I'll put it that way. It's very funny.
So I just want to point out, Nathaniel just came and handed me this beer that he just bought.
That
It's
is
called
awesome.
Gilgamesh.
That is freaking awesome.
That's the best.
But if you guys, if I recall correctly, they also did a reading of Gilgamesh, which you can find on there.
In Dr. Josh and his stuff.
Yes.
Digital Hammurabi.
On Digital Hammurabi.
That is awesome.
So this is a good, if you guys want to kind of find out more about it from actual scholars who study this stuff, like that list has information on not just, like at the bottom, not just Gilgamesh, but a number of different bits of Mesopotamian literature, which they translate and talk about. They also have their Sumerian book club, their Digital Hammurabi book club version of this, but with ancient literature, which they live stream fairly regularly, and there's a playlist on their channel as well. So if you guys haven't checked that stuff out, and you are piqued, your interest is piqued by us talking about the ending of Gilgamesh tonight, there's lots more resources on that playlist and on the channel overall. So you said that you had written your Susan version of the section of the Epic of Gilgamesh that he covers here, which is mostly the end of Gilgamesh.
Yeah. So Ehrman talks about like the discovery of the Epic of Gilgamesh and how it sort of largely went unknown until about the mid-19th century, because they were doing some excavations, some archaeological excavations in Nineveh, which if you are at all like me and did not realize and learn until today that that was the ancient capital of Assyria. I learned something new today, so yay. They were all super stoked because it had this like flood narrative that was a lot like Noah in the Old Testament, but it's actually older than that. So they think that Gilgamesh was actually the source for the Noah flood narrative. They had found other portions of it later on. Some of those portions actually date back to about 2100 BCE, which, you know, for reference, some of the portions of the Old Testament are from about, or some of like the older portions are from about 1,000 years later. So just for like frame of reference and like a time frame sort of thing. Oh, don't go up. Scroll down. There we go. Okay, so Susan's Gilgamesh. I feel like this should be its own little like video and stuff. I'm very excited for this. So Gilgamesh was a king and a superhero, basically. He was 2 parts divine and 1 part human, and he's what I like to believe a self-insert Mary Sue into an epic story that came from some guy's deepest desires. I don't know, work with me here. Gilgamesh was kind of a dick, and one of the goddesses creates a mortal equal to him that starts out as his worst enemy, and they actually end up becoming best friends. Well, the gods are so peeved at Gilgamesh being a jerk that they send down the Bull of Heaven to fight Gilgamesh and the mortal, Enkidu, thank you. I never know how to pronounce stuff because I always just learn it from reading. Enkidu and the 2 kill the bull. So the gods decide that they don't like this, and they say that one of the 2 of them has to die. Enkidu knows it has to be him since he's mortal, and we have a bit of the story that talks about Enkidu's terror of death. So Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh mourns and starts to come to terms with the reality of his own death, and Gilgamesh decides that he needs a path to immortality. So this is where we find that precursor to the global flood story from the Bible, but, you know, we've already talked about that, so neither here nor there.
Well, and there's a bunch of different versions of it, right? Like, a lot of people like to compare it to the Bible. It's very different from the Bible, mind you. Like,
right.
It's only similar in the sense of, okay, there was a flood and a bunch of animals got put on a boat and one dude knew about it. But, like, even then, it was the gods were angry at humans for making a giant noise, and that's the reason they flooded the earth and stuff like that. There's a lot of differences between the stories. People who overly compare them, like, obviously there is a cultural sort of relationship between the 2 of them. They come from similar areas. But when you actually read the stories, there is very much a great deal of cultural drift between the 2. And there's a lot of cooler stuff, I think, in Gilgamesh than there is in the flood story.
There really is. Yeah, Gilgamesh in general. And I'm not saying this as just somebody who, you know, is an atheist and doesn't give a lot of credit to the Bible, because I feel like I don't give enough credit to the Bible.
Oh, dude, there's some cool shit in the Bible. Like, there's some of the most epic ancient love poetry ever written. There's an area where somebody pisses off a prophet and he sticks bears on him. Like there's all kinds of cool shit in the Bible.
Yeah,
but this story, there other cultures did it better.
That's true. That's very, very true. So the main character in this particular global flood story, Utnapishtim, is granted the gift of immortality from the gods for being all obedient and stuff. He's still basically just a human that never dies. So Gilgamesh sets out on this mission to find Utnapishtim and discover the secrets of immortality. When he eventually meets up with him, after a lot of talk about the gods and death and all that, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about the flood and why he is actually worthy of the immortality that's been granted. So Gilgamesh keeps pestering him about how to become immortal, and Utnapishtim eventually tells him about another way to these ends, other than, just, being obedient and stuff. So there's this thorny plant at the bottom of the sea that will allow Gilgamesh to be restored to his former youthful glory as, quote, an antidote to the fear of death. And away he goes. Gilgamesh finds where he needs to go, and it's, of course, at the bottom of the sea, and he ties rocks to his feet and dives deep down. Now, I should probably mention right about here that, as if you can't tell, this is not going to go very well for our buddy Gilgamesh. So while he gets the plant and makes his way home, Gilgamesh decides he's going to go for a swim in this pool of water. And while he's in the pool, a snake gets wind of the plant, or a serpent, gets wind of the plant that Gilgamesh has and, of course, steals it. Just like the serpent stole eternal life from Adam and Eve. See what we did there. He's all distraught and stuff, and much like everyone else, has to die eventually.
These ancient cultures had a lot of problems with snakes.
They really did. They really, really did. It's like they're just convinced that every single one of them is, incredibly sneaky and just wants to fool everybody. So there is a slightly different version, or a different part of the story, I guess, that has the same sort of message about death that's mildly more depressing. It's okay, more than mildly, where Gilgamesh had made these two objects from a sacred tree that were for him and Enkidu, and in order to try and Enkidu, sorry, I always one of these days I'm going to learn how to say it. So Enkidu decides that he is going to go and try and find this. So I guess he just didn't want to risk going himself because he's going to go to the underworld, and Gilgamesh gives Enkidu very specific instructions on what to do to retrieve the objects. Enkidu gets all rebellious and ignores Gilgamesh and basically dies since he gets lost in the underworld. The god Ea, orders the king of the underworld to allow Enkidu to communicate with Gilgamesh to tell him what it's really like with the whole death and underworld thing.
I think this would be a good place to actually read the quote from that they quote in Heaven and Hell as well, because it's quite poetic, the translation that he uses.
It really is. A lot of this, and I didn't really realize because I had not studied Gilgamesh like at all up until now, and it's so much of it is just so gorgeous. Like it's such amazing, like beautiful prose.
Well, and part of that is because it comes from a oral tradition, and like one of the things like Haida storytellers, there's this rhythmic, repetitive sort of structure, not only to help you learn the oral tradition, like there's a Wansuga is repeated quite frequently, which means they say when you're telling the story of Raven traveling, the quartet. Like there's a version of that in many of the different stories because it helps you establish the rhythm of the poetry, and it also makes it quite beautiful to listen to. And so you get triple repetitions like that throughout a lot of Sumerian stories as well.
Yeah, and it's a lot of stuff, much like in stuff today, where stuff that they sort of had to make it work in the written word, because so much of the stuff that sounds really, really great spoken doesn't quite sound as good written. Like it sounds very, very stilted, or at least that I've found is the difference between my my writing for when I'm actually going to have a speaking part versus my writing when it's like my prose writing. Stuff that tends to be the speaking part writing can sound kind of stilted when you're just reading it, but the way that they were able to make everything just sound so beautiful, it's like, this is amazing. I love it. All right. So Enkidu basically tells Gilgamesh, I'll read the entire passage, that if he really knew what the afterlife was like, he would not mourn his friend's death. He'd actually mourn himself, because the afterlife sucks that much. So this is the passage here. This is the right one, right? Yes. And the spirit of Enkidu came out of the earth like a gust of wind. They hugged and kissed. They discussed. They agonized. Tell me, my friend. Tell me, my friend. Tell me Earth's conditions that you found. I can't tell you, my friend. I can't tell you. If I tell you Earth's conditions that I found, you must sit and weep. Your wife whom you touched and your heart was glad, vermin eat like an old garment. Your son whom you touched and your heart was glad, sits in a crevice full of dust. Woe, she said, and groveled in the dust. Woe, he said, and groveled in the dust. That's heavy.
Yeah, and Bart follows up by basically telling you, if, the message is pretty clear. If you knew what the afterlife was like, you would weep.
Yeah. There's lots of woes and stuff. So it's, you can always tell how serious something is when, based on the number of woes. But yeah, it's, I really seriously want to look more into anything having to do with Gilgamesh, because I am oddly fascinated by this. And it's not just the idea of like what it's like with the afterlife, but it's also just sort of in general. Like if the entirety of the Epic of Gilgamesh is writing that is like this, then it's like, I think it's going to be thoroughly enjoyable. So if you have read the Epic of Gilgamesh, please let me know what I'm in for.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts that are missing, and if you listen to, like I said, I think that there's a very good translation of it on Digital Hammurabi. They read it really, really well. There are bits that are hard to understand because there's stuff missing. There are bits that some translators try to fill in. It's definitely worth getting into, but you kind of have to have a commentary to go along with it so you can kind of understand what's going on in some parts, because there's a lot of things that the storyteller kind of takes for granted that you would understand reading this.
That makes sense. Yeah. So you sort of have to be able to either fill in holes yourself or find somebody who's already filled in the holes, I guess. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, like I said, if you guys scroll up just a little bit in the live chat, there's a link to a playlist there. That's Digital Hammurabi's covering of... It's their playlist of a bunch of different things, but there's a rap for Gilgamesh that sums up the entirety of the plot of Gilgamesh quite well. And they also have, intertextual commentaries and stuff on it. So if you guys want to dig deeper, they're a fantastic resource and an amazing ally of the channel. We did a great interview with them a little while back on Seeing Red, and we talk about interfaith discourse and how Christians shouldn't feel as threatened by historical studies as they are, and I think that it's a really fun interview if you guys get a chance to check that out too.
Yes.
So in the next part of the chapter, we get to Socrates and the alternative to the fear of death, which is this idea that death may actually be a relief from the suffering of life, which to a certain degree, the idea of heaven kind of comes from a little bit, but with Socrates, he wasn't even really sure if there was an afterlife. He just wasn't all that sure that you should be that concerned with death, which is part of the reason that the Stoics became obsessed with him.
That's understandable. So what I do really, really love the basic overall idea that Socrates is going for, in that, he does, I'm only mildly jumping ahead. He talks, about, if there is a heaven or if there is an afterlife, it could be really, really great. It could be awesome. But, he does that sort of dichotomy where, actually it's not a false dichotomy, but it is a dichotomy. If there's an afterlife, then great. But if there's not, the alternative, which is just the non-existence, isn't that terrible. Like, it's not something that's, something to be necessarily, scared of.
Yeah,
and that's what I believe from it anyway.
Well, and on page 38 and 39, like at the bottom of page 38, he has this quote that Ehrman pulls up from him talking to the jury at his trial. Because for those of you who don't know, he got put on trial and executed for impiety, which in Athens meant doing things religiously or putting forward religious ideas that the establishment didn't like very much. Basically, Athens was very much a theocracy, and no, Hellenist will shy away from that. And his some of his philosophical ideas, there was this idea that associating with the gods were the lifeblood of Athens, effectively. So if you were putting forward ideas that did not work, much like what the Catholic Church did, there was a threat potentially to the safety of the city. So he was put on trial for impiety. They accused him of atheism, but it's clear in his speeches and in his preaching, on the Stoa, so to speak, that he in no way was an atheist himself. He just had different ideas about the gods than the Athenians did. And this comes out when he's talking to the jury about the afterlife, because during this time, a lot of people had this sort of Homeric view of the afterlife, which we'll get to in chapter 3. But I'll let you go ahead and read the quote from him. There's the quote from Apology 29a through b, and another quote from Apology 35a.
So this is that first one. For let me tell you, gentlemen, that to be afraid of death is only another form of thinking that one is wise when one is not. It is to think that one knows what one does not know. No one knows, with regard to death, whether it is not really the greatest blessing that can happen to a person, but people dread it as though it were the greatest evil, and this ignorance, which thinks that it knows what it does not, must surely be ignorance most culpable. Damn.
Yeah,
I really like this guy.
Yeah, like, again, the Stoics became pretty obsessed with him, because basically what he used his trial to do was to continue to do what they didn't want him to, which was preach. Yeah. So, like, they built their entire concept of the sage just about over hero worship of Socrates, because even when he drank the hemlock and it didn't kill him, like, he kept talking and he kept preaching to his followers right up until it finally took his life.
He was pretty stubborn.
Yeah, he was like the OG Stoic. He really was. And Zeno of Citium was eventually inspired by him. But later in his speech, Apology 35a.
We got, I've often noticed that some people go to extraordinary lengths when they come up for trial with a possible death sentence, which shows that they think it will be a dreadful thing to lose their lives, as though they would be immortal if you did not put them to death.
Which is a really interesting observation about human nature, because we have this instinct to survive, right? It's written into our DNA. Like, we want to survive and reproduce. But at the same time, again, we come back to, you can't imagine your own annihilation, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
Like, it's basically impossible to fathom that.
Yeah, and I think it's like like you just said, we're so focused on the survival, and I think it also has to do a lot with if we are forced to come to terms with our own mortality, and the idea that basically death is inevitable regardless of what you do. It's, to me, the idea of death is not quite as terrifying if you have those ideas to come to terms with.
Well, not only that, but it's an end to mortal suffering, right? Like, the threat of heaven and hell is even more existentially terrifying, I think, than the idea of death and oblivion, because, as Socrates points out in Apology, which I've read, by the way, and it's a brilliant piece of work. Like, one of his students recorded it, and if you guys enjoy ancient snark, as much as I would recommend Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics for his absolutely brilliant takedown of Plato's idea of the forms, their Apology is a brutal takedown of the idea of putting people to death for crimes against the state, because in his words, well, nobody would be put to death for crimes against the state if what we are told is true and your soul goes somewhere, because of course you are now immortal. So he's like, death can't possibly be a punishment. Either you're sleeping forever, and there's no more pain and suffering, you're basically gone, or your soul just goes to a different state. And, in his view, there wasn't a punishment or a reward there. There was just a different place that you go to, which is what I've talked about frequently when people ask me about my views of the afterlife. I think you just go to a different place. The realms of Hades have been described by various authors in a bunch of different ways, including later the Platonists attached the fields of Elysium to various things, and added a bunch of rewards and punishments, and people getting kicked off the boat by Charon because they were assholes, and then having their soul actually go to oblivion, which is the closest to punishment you really get. And you have the Homeric view, which is discussed in depth in the next chapter, but that's kind of where you end up in this position where you're a shade, effectively, where you can't enjoy anything, but you can't really remember who you are either until offerings are given by your descendants, which is part of the reason why Triakos was so important to the ancient Greeks, where then you can enjoy pleasure briefly in a measured response and come back and remember who you are briefly for that night under the power of Hecate. Yeah. So those things were basically the only two sort of major ideas of the afterlife for a while. The Stoics came up with their own, the Epicureans did as well. But the major view of the afterlife were basically either the Platonist view of the Elysian fields and the potential to kind of become a daimon, which is like a helper spirit, and come back to the earth. Or, if you're really, really awesome and you're remembered through like all of history, like Alexander the Great or something like that, you're still sort of worshipped in the modern day, then you get to go to this like eternal paradise, kind of like heaven. But even then, this idea of eternal punishment, the closest you get to that is getting kicked off the boat and just stopping to exist slowly as you lose your memories.
Yeah.
Because you don't deserve to be a person anymore. But there was even an idea of fate kind of owing people reincarnation. So the Greek afterlife was fairly complex depending on which philosophical school you talk to, and none of them claimed to absolutely know.
That makes sense.
But Socrates' whole point is, why would you be so scared of death if you're either just going to stop suffering forever, which, let's face it, this is ancient Greece, your life probably sucks, or you're going to go to a different place that is probably, no better or worse than it is here, right?
Yeah, I think the way that he puts it is a migration of the soul from this place to another. And the idea, if it's just the non-existence, it's like death must be a marvelous gain that's closer to this deep and dreamless sleep. And I know what is going on with my watch. Sorry. So he does, I did see a little bit later on that it might not have been so much Socrates as, the people he was talking to, like, students and stuff. But it wasn't necessarily him with the afterlife, but it was, he was sort of talking to people because that's sort of what they wanted to hear.
Well, and with Socrates, most of his words we actually get through Plato,
right?
Because Plato was his student.
Yeah.
So
through that lens, so there's a lot of the Plato influence in it, I imagine.
And there's another quote from Phaedo on page 41 that where he kind of talks about embracing death.
Mm-hmm.
It's the one that starts with, "I want to explain to you."
Yes, yeah. I want to explain to you how it seems to me natural that a man who has really devoted his life to philosophy should be cheerful in the face of death and confident of finding the greatest blessing in the next world when his life is finished. Ordinary people seem not to realize that those who really apply themselves in the right way to philosophy are directly and of their own accord preparing themselves for dying and death. I love this stuff. I don't know why I love this stuff so much. And this is all stuff that, like, I've never, it's stuff that I don't get a chance to think about a lot. And I don't know, I feel like you and I have had a conversation before about, like, the idea of, like, the Stoicism stuff.
Mm-hmm.
How it's something that I really can sort of identify with. And I think that's why I like this stuff so much. And I like the way that Ehrman is bringing a lot of this stuff up, is because it's something that I'm finding myself really identifying with, and being able to find, a way to put it in those words that actually make it relatable for me.
Well, and this is one of the things where if you really want to get into Stoicism, I recommend anybody who can get their hands on a good translation of it read the Enchiridion. Epictetus talks at length, and so does Chrysippus, though Chrysippus is a much worse writer. And Chrysippus we only have fragments of, whereas like with Epictetus, we have the Enchiridion, which again is one of the students recording his lectures, but there's a lot of this idea of there are two things that there are two different classifications of things. There are things you can control, which basically means your thoughts and nothing else. And he goes into this big, long diatribe about that. Because you can't even fully control your actions, because if, say, your arm is paralyzed, you are no longer able to move it. So you can't control your action no matter how much you will yourself to, but you can accept that your arm is paralyzed. That is a way that you can control your thoughts. Yeah. And then things you can't control, and your own death is one of those. And so one of the Stoic exercises, inspired actually by Socrates, and this is one of the reasons I keep going on about Stoicism, is the idea of imagining your own death every morning when you wake up, until you eventually are so desensitized to the idea of it that you are no longer either afraid of death or wishing for it. It is just a fact of life, in the same way that getting up and putting your shoes on is. Because if you conquer the fear of death, you can conquer almost any other phobia in your life by acclimating yourself to it. It's a form of exposure therapy.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think a lot, I can see from a certain perspective, and this is not my perspective, how that could be like, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for. I mean, not really like a defeatist, maybe sort of like a defeatist attitude, but then at the same time, it's not really defeatist because it's just something that you have to come to terms with at some point.
Well, yeah, and I think that when people get older, it's a lot easier to come to terms with it. Whereas, like, when you're younger, it's hard for you to even imagine death because you've barely lived life, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I still have more, on average, years left in my life to live than I've even lived yet. And especially when you're younger, like, there's this idea that young people think they're immortal, and then you get more cautious with your life as you get older. And I think part of that is because you have a lot more things to lose.
That's true. Yeah. And then that, like, I don't know. I agree. I like it.
So we're kind of coming up on the end of the discussion of Socrates, but there's a really salient point that Ehrman makes at the end, and that was after he drank the hemlock and he finally, starts to lay himself down to rest, Socrates asks his followers to sacrifice a cock to Asclepios. Asclepios, for the record, for those of you who aren't Hellenists, was the son of Apollon. He was the patron of doctors, and he's actually part of the reason why I say modern medicine and science are actually sacred to Hellenists. Like, we consider modern medicine to be a gift of the gods, because not only is reason a blessing from the gods, like, it is the spark of the divine reason within us is the reason the god took interest in us, but also, like, science itself was a gift from one of the titans. And, medicine is a gift from Asclepios. So if you don't go and get the best treatment you possibly can for yourself, you're effectively spitting in the eye of one of the gods. So this idea of, again, medical denial absolutely boggles my fucking mind as a Hellenist. But sacrificing a cock to Asclepios is a way to thank him for healing you. So effectively, when he died and he said, sacrifice a cock to Asclepios, he was living out the last bit of this philosophy where he's like, I should be thankful for death because on the other side, I will have nothing to fear. Either I'm going to be sleeping for the rest of eternity, or I'm just going to be going somewhere else. And I can't imagine that the gods would in some way punish me for doing what I believe to be the right thing and dedicating my life to philosophy and dying as I lived, which again makes him a certified motherfucking badass. And it's part of the reason why he inspired Zeno of Citium and others going down the line to found this idea of Stoicism, because this was just such a mind-blowing thing for someone to do, to preach right up until the moment that they died.
Yeah, because that's how he spent like the last, like, I don't even know how long do we have any idea of like how long it was that actually took for the hemlock to actually
I think it was
him?
like 2 days worth of trials, and I think he had to drink it twice, because the first time it didn't kill him and the second time it did.
Damn. Wow. Yeah. But I like the fact you're saying he's just such a badass, because he's just doing what he loved up until the end. And
he was completely at peace with it. Like,
yeah.
Like, he even says in his apology, I don't understand why people are so afraid to die, because it's not like you would live forever if you didn't get killed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And Socrates seems to believe that he's just really done things the right way. And I say the right way in that, the way that he believed to be, the right way to do things. He did things, he was true to himself about it. He did things what he believed was right, up until
He
the
had
very,
no
very
regrets.
end. Yeah, exactly. And I feel like that's just such a good way to view it, and to live your life. You've got to live your life doing the things that you believe to be right, and not just based on, whatever everybody else tells you. But
Well,
sort
I
of
mean,
based
he
on your
talked
own
it.
principles.
Well, and he talked at length how anybody who dedicates themselves fully to philosophy, and I would say that applies for almost any school of philosophy, the Epicureans and the hedonists, like both of them, or even the skeptics, like the whole idea was this is the best way to live. I have devoted myself fully to this. So that way you've lived your fullest life. And if you die at any point, when they say live each day as if it is your last, that is both a Stoic thing, but it's also almost any of the main philosophical schools, including Platonism. The idea is perpetually bettering yourself.
Yeah. Make sure that you're making the most of what you have, and living in the moment, and making sure that you can, yeah, like you said, just be the best that you can be.
Well, and so Socrates points out, if you are doing this, why would you ever be afraid to die? You could get hit by a car tomorrow, and, your soul, if there is an afterlife, are you going to be sitting there mourning the things you didn't do? Or are you just in a new place? This is your new transition.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really beautiful way to look at it. Like, he even admitted he didn't know whether he was going to cease to exist or whether he was just going to go to a different place. But either way, it's better than being here. Because here you're perpetually afraid to lose something that you don't even know if it's actually lost.
Yeah. And I think I did a little note about the sacrifice to Asclepius, which, again, thank you for teaching me how these things are pronounced. I very much appreciate that. As a way to thank Asclepius for Socrates being healed. And it's not, it's sort of, I'm trying to figure out how to phrase the way that I want to say this, because I've said a lot of because he's basically being healed from the life where people thought he was doing wrong.
The life of persecution, effectively. He was being healed from his persecution and either getting to rest for eternity or ceasing to be, or getting to go somewhere else where he couldn't be persecuted.
Yeah, which were all very, very preferable outcomes in the grand scheme of things. So yeah, I really dig the attitude that Socrates had, and it's a good way to sort of keep your head up in the face of your inevitable death, and making sure that you're just doing good and being a good person, and doing everything you can to live the life that you want to live.
Well, and acceptance of your inevitable death is the closest you can come to conquering it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, that's the closest anybody has ever come, I think, to conquering death, because at that point it holds no power over you. Right. And those who threaten your death hold no power over you.
Mm-hmm. I like it.
And, again, I think Socrates was quite wise in that regard, in the sense that, again, it's not like you're going to go behave recklessly, but at the same time, you're not going to do things, you're not going to do the wrong thing to protect your own life. And the Stoics really latched onto that concept. They talk a lot about not doing what is wrong to preserve your own life, or doing what is wrong, to preserve your reputation or things like that, because you can't control when you're going to die, but you can control your integrity, you can control your thoughts, you can control what you are willing to do. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, it's fate's decision whether you live or die at any given time. All you can do is do your best to act within accordance of your virtues. Yeah. And a lot of that came from Socrates. Like, a lot of the foundations of Stoicism came from him.
I like it a lot. I really want to, and this is coming from somebody who typically is not a really big reader. I think my sort of place in a lot of this, the literary circle stuff, has sort of been coming at stuff from sort of a layman's point of view, you know, for people who may not necessarily know as much stuff about this as you and Nathaniel and you know, people like y'all. But it makes me very, very interested in seeing, you know, learning more about Socrates and the way that he thinks. And I know I said this earlier, but I love the way that Ehrman makes all of these ideas, because he is presenting a lot of information. Like, you know, regardless of what chapter you're looking at, he's presenting a lot of information, but he's presenting it in such a manner that it's not daunting, it's not intimidating. It's very matter of fact, it's also put in such a manner that someone who is like me can understand. You know what I mean? I like it.
Well, I mean, it's very presentable, it's very readable, and it whets your appetite to kind of go and look at those sources. Like, I've been looking into potentially reading, you got some love in the chat.
From, is it from Nathaniel?
Of course it is.
Aww.
But, like, it sort of whets your appetite to dig deeper into things, which is one of those things that I love about, like, good scholarly writing. It's one of those things that Stephen Jay Gould actually got me into paleontology, because I fell in love with a bunch of his essays. You know, Richard Dawkins did something similar, because I never read his God delusion stuff. I read The Ancestor's Tale first, because I was a Cambrian era arthropod geek, and I picked up The Ancestor's Tale because I was reading anything I could find on evolution and paleontology, and that book just absolutely captured my imagination and got me interested in genetics, because I'd never really been all that interested in the hard side of science before. I was more interested in the fossils and all of that stuff. And of course, later on, I came to learn, you know, as I went through school, that there was as much of the chemical side to science and paleontology as anything else. But, like, it got me more interested in the modern day aspects, rather than just, you know, dealing with the bones and dealing with, you know, carbon print fossils and things like that, and learning what you can from them.
Yeah.
So, for next week, hopefully Nathaniel will be back with us, but next week we're going to be talking about life after death, before there was life after death, aka the Homeric view of death, the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Ooh, oh man, I remember reading those when I was a senior in high school. I feel like I probably didn't appreciate the Iliad and the Odyssey nearly as much as I could now. Like, I feel like I could probably read the Iliad, well, probably not get through it very quickly, or either of them very quickly, but I could probably appreciate them a lot more now than I did when I was 17, 18 years old. I like it.
Yeah, Nathaniel says, hopefully I'll be back next week. Hopefully. But yeah, we're going to be talking about the Homeric view of death, and I have a few things to say about about this idea that the Homeric view of death was kind of the main or only one for a while, because that's not entirely true. There were a number of different views of death from various schools of philosophy, and also presented in other plays and stories. So, like, I think that maybe he was right that a lot of people viewed death that way, overall, because the Iliad and the Odyssey were so famous, and because there was this oral tradition of reciting them even from, you know, a young age. But I think that there was a bit more diversity in Greek thought than Ehrman kind of presents here a little bit, and I wanted to kind of address that next week. So we're going to talk about that. For those of you who do have the book at home, you know, that we're going to be reading through chapter 3 next week and covering it. We're hoping to keep these episodes to around 45 minutes to an hour going forward, covering one chapter a week, because that gives us just enough time to kind of deep dive into stuff and discuss it a little bit. So that's where we're heading. If you guys don't have a copy yet, we actually have a link to the publisher directly to give Ehrman the biggest cut that he can get, because as an author, that is super important. You can get the ebook for just like $15. If you can't get it there, one of the easiest way to get your hands on the ebook is to check your library out and see if they do ebooks, because this book came out this year, but it only came out a couple of months ago, so a lot of libraries have had a chance to actually get it. You can get it for free at your library, and they did already pay the author. Yes. So that is one way that you can get your hands on it for a severely reduced price without having to do anything, you know, not particularly charitable. So thank you guys so much for joining us. We're hoping to continue chapter by chapter. We're hoping you guys will read alongside us so that you kind of have a little bit of a context for the discussion. The idea of the show is that we kind of cover the stuff in the book, but it's not supposed to necessarily be a replacement for reading it. We kind of want to delve a little more into various topics that interest us and kind of discuss it the way that you would with a physical, book club.
Yeah.
So, again, thank you all for joining us, and we will see you guys next week. Be the conversation, and let's hope the community can line up around something that's better than drama.
Exactly.
Whoops, it briefly kicked me out of the broadcast studio before I could hit end broadcast. Give me a second. Sorry about that, guys.